Hi, my name is Martin Lowenfish. I am the branch chief at area-wide planning at NRCS, and I'll be presenting today with my colleague Tim Griffiths, the West's Working Land for Wildlife coordinator at NRCS. And as the title says, we will be talking about our landscape scale frameworks that we're developing to address wildlife, agriculture, and incorporate climate change into that approach. As many of you know, the climate change has been a key priority for the Biden administration, and for USDA, a lot of the way we'll be talking about climate change and climate resilience is going to be captured under the term climate smart agriculture. We have up on the screen a definition from the UN Food and Agriculture Agency that provides for the sustainability of agriculture itself. But if you look at the excerpt from the new climate EO from the Biden administration, there's an incredible focus on protecting and conserving the lands, waters, and biodiversity of the United States. This is not a new focus for NRCS, and the historic approach the agency has taken to conservation incorporates a landscape approach that is science-based, focuses on a landscape scale approach, and incorporates the leadership from local people and local producers. NRCS has incorporated this landscape scale approach in what we've called our landscape conservation initiatives, which have provided targeted funding to accelerate this locally driven approach and achieve measurable outcomes for clean water, wildlife species, and other resource concerns across the country. One aspect of the landscape conservation initiatives that many of you should be familiar with is the Working Lands for Wildlife approach, which is a broader approach, as I just said, rather than a funding source or a funding program. Again, the focus is to implement enough of the right practices in the right places to benefit populations, all based on strong science foundation, science that can incorporate the impacts of climate change. And to date, we've enrolled 7,400 private landowners, and they've conserved collectively more than 10 million acres across the country. Part of the success of the Working Lands for Wildlife approach has been the development of what we call investment strategies that provide a multi-year outlook on how NRCS is going to address or deliver the dedicated funding for these species across the landscapes, again, based on the science. But we recognize that taking a successful approach to the broad challenges, not just for wildlife, but to agriculture, takes a broader approach, and the science is behind all of these investment strategies. And that's why we're now taking a broader approach to bring the science and the conservation planning framework at a landscape scale more to the fore, and we are publishing these what we're calling conservation frameworks for biomes now across the West. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim, who's going to talk about how these frameworks are developed and how they can incorporate climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. When we were developing the new conservation frameworks out west, the first thing we did was try to put into context why we care so much about rangeland and why others should too. Quantified a lot of statistics like, did you realize 1 out of every 3 acres in the entire lower 48 is comprised of rangelands? Out west, that number's even ballooned up to 70% of all lands are composed of rangeland. 2/3 of those lands are owned by private landowners. And livestock grazing is the single land use that sustains this resource across the entire biome. Not only are these lands important for those local communities and for ag production, these are biological hotbeds. This is where hundreds of species make their living and why we need to focus on conserving it. There's also strong climate implications associated with rangeland. And we know that as we're trying to implement climate smart actions into Department of Agriculture, that western rangelands can play a meaningful role there. When you look at carbon in rangeland environment, you realize that there's two components. There's a plant component and then there's a soil component. And if you divide the two, it's not even fair. Soils win every time. It's about a 90% of the carbon is sequestered in the soils versus in the plants. And so going to climate smart mitigation, the number one action science recommends is that we simply avoid conversion of grasslands and shrublands, or this ACOGs. And so goal number one is keep grass green side up and don't allow conversion of those soils where those carbon that is stored is lost, as also the ability to store future carbon is lost. Aside from mitigation, we can also play a role in bolstering the overall resiliency of that rangeland, which then allows the land to adapt to changing environments. It allows the increased fire, the drought or deluge, all of these environmental extremes. It allows that land the ability to adapt, which is so important for both people and wildlife that depend upon it. Both of those actions are built into these frameworks. Frameworks also provide a working lands worldview. Again, recognizing that 2/3 of all of these lands are owned and operated by private agricultural producers, it's important that we work with those communities to ensure that the solutions that are created work for their private operation as well as the broader needs of the resource. And so, again, as Martin had mentioned, Working Lands for Wildlife operates in this sweet spot where we find intact landscape cores that overlap with important wildlife populations and also have people, have communities that are ready, willing, and able to act and move the needle on conservation in those landscapes. That's the sweet spot that we work under into Working Lands for Wildlife and is the heart of these frameworks. It's also important to recognize that these frameworks aren't a Lone Ranger type approach where we are out doing things that are in isolation. In fact, we are very much involved with broader partnerships that are working on much larger umbrella documents that can serve these very geographies. So for instance, in the sagebrush system, many of you are familiar or have been working with the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on their new sagebrush conservation strategy, or in the Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory led the tri-national effort to conserve central grasslands through their development of a roadmap. Know that both of these new frameworks you can consider as NRCS's contribution to that broader regional plan. Very important concept. All of the frameworks also incorporate the latest and greatest in science and technology. This new science is available not only in peer-reviewed literature and journals, but also in spatial platforms that allow us to see and measure the world in new and innovative ways. Those findings then also allow us to develop unique approaches that at the heart foster a preventative care approach rather than emergency or ambulance type approach, where we are finding these intact cores and first and foremost maintaining and defending that core, and then we are growing the core and then mitigating impacts, in stark contrast to the way we've often worked, where we're putting out fires, sending ambulances to deal with emergency. We're trying to shift the entire focus from emergency to preventative care. Frameworks also are built on an incredible scientific foundation. And so there is a full scientific rationale and justification for everything that we are doing that is embedded within the framework. And in fact, when you get the PDF copy, you'll be able to click, like here, the superscript number 1, and it will go to the companion online resource, so you can just learn not only where that reference is found, but it'll give a little bit of text to put that piece of science in context, and then it'll have a link to the actual peer-reviewed publication. So again, heavily referenced, but it's written in a way that can be consumed by all folks and stakeholders that want to use these frameworks. So let's take a deep dive into the Great Plains grassland and look at how all of this comes together. On the right, you're going to see a figure that was put together by one of our science partners, Dirac Twidwell, at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he was using this new resource that we've worked with University of Montana to build. It's called the Rangeland Analysis Platform, and what that does, it tracks vegetation across space and time and allows us to see things really for the first time ever at biome levels. And so take on the left, the blue are intact grasslands, the red are grasslands that have been converted to woodlands through the expansion of woody species, whether it's eastern red cedar in the north or honey mesquite in the south. It's all about this continued march of woody vegetation into grasslands. And so what we've seen is the red in the last 2 decades has converted over 100 million acres of grasslands to woodlands. Massive implications for wildlife. We document the fact that prairie chickens are, as one example, are very sensitive to increased fragmentation with trees. We've documented the loss of livestock forage. Neighborhood of 75% of forage is lost as these transitions happen. But for the first time ever, we've been able to quantify the scale at which it's happening and where. And so now on the left side of the graph, if you look at the primary driver of grassland loss in the Great Plains is conversion of grassland to tillage agriculture, cultivation. And so juxtaposed to that, though, for the first time ever, we recognize that this woody expansion is really on par with grassland loss due to cultivation. And so these are the 2 big drivers then that our frameworks are going to focus on, not the nickel and dime things, but the things that are the biome level drivers of loss and degradation. And so what does that mean, right? So let's go look a little deeper at the woody encroachment issue, to where on the right side, you're going to see from woodland transition, these are the areas that have already been converted from a grassland to a woodland. And if you move there to right, you'll see a gradation where in expansion, those are individual trees that you can visually see above the grass. The yellow area would be the places where a lot of new seeds or seedlings that are below the grass, where you might not even recognize you have a problem before it's too late. And then on the far right, you would have this intact grassland. In the past, we've always worked where we observed the problem. right? So where we see the forest where it used to be grass, or we see new forest coming in, that's where we would invest our resources collectively. And we would do brush management in those landscapes while at the same time maybe not paying attention to our backside and having dispersal and recruitment eat our lunch. And so those new seed sources were expanding at such a rate that we were continuing to lose the battle, even though we were fighting the war every day, or vice versa. Um, and so what we've done through this framework is really flip the script to where now again go to that green, right? That is where we find these intact grasslands. Defend that core, then grow the core, right? That's where the yellow and then mitigate impacts would be in the red. So it's again it's about taking a brand new science driven approach of putting the right practices in the right places to achieve these outcomes that we desire. And that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do here. Um, the other big driver of grassland loss in the Great Plains is, again, like we mentioned, the cultivation. Um, Fascinating looking at that situation where if you look at the map on the left, you'll see that Great Plains grasslands are colored red, yellow, and green based on cultivation risk, where red is high, green is low. If you juxtapose that on the right, you with what's actually already been converted, you will see that most of those high and medium risk tillage have already been converted to crops. Um, but what's happening is even today, we're still losing about 1 million acres a year to cultivation. And the new fields that are being cultivated are lower in crop yields than the average. And so what's happening is as we continue to still chip away at these grasslands and convert them to cultivated fields, we are now tilling and putting in production more and more marginal fields at huge cost to wildlife, carbon, and so forth. In fact, people find it surprising that the rates of loss, like in this northern region, in what they call the prairie pothole region, the current rates of loss rival those of the loss of forest in the Brazilian Amazon. So it is a big deal. It's happening at a very large scale, and it really it shouldn't surprise anybody that the new science journal that documented the bird loss had this particular region in these grasslands as kind of the poster child for measured impacts to wildlife. So, what are we going to do about it, right? What can we do about it? Well, first is understanding what's causing the current loss of grasslands to cultivated fields. And at the heart of this is really understanding our nation's largest conservation program, the Conservation Reserve Program. So, real quick, for those of you not familiar with it, this was a program that was established back in 1985. Department of Agriculture, it's our sister agency, Farm Service Agency, has really done a phenomenal job taking formerly converted grasslands and restoring those and putting back grass green side up, and then provides that landowner with an annual rental payment to maintain that grassland. And those are short-term, 10 to 15-year contracts that ultimately expire and sometimes are extended, or sometimes not. And so in the past, again, tens of millions of acres have been restored and maintained through this program. The bad news is that the acreage caps and the opportunities to re-enroll are just greatly reduced today. And as those properties come out of CRP, the landowners really have a choice. They can either cultivate those lands and revert back to cropland, or they can find another way to maintain the grass green side up and replace that lost income stream, right? But today, look at the bottom here. This is the take home message. This outlook and that determination is so important because acreage exiting CRP today is the largest source of grassland loss in the nation. I'm going to read it one more time. Acreage exiting CRP today is the largest source of grassland loss in the nation. We have to recognize where we're losing grass if we're going to be able to solve it. So our frameworks are taking a new or novel approach to trying to proactively address this particular threat with the tools in our toolbox. What we are aspiring to do is retain grass exiting CRP by replacing lost annual payments from CRP with revenue generated from sustainable livestock grazing. And we believe there is incredible opportunity for widespread adoption, as currently only 5% of fields coming out of CRP are enrolled in another program. They just did a massive evaluation of tens of thousands of CRP contracts in the Great Plains and found that landowners are highly interested in retaining grasslands if only they have a way to replace that lost income stream. And in fact, that on their own, they were already retaining 58% of those lands that expired through the use of livestock grazing as the mechanism to replace that revenue stream. So again, this is also something that ties back to that primary ACOGs, right, with the climate goal of, first and foremost, our number one job out west in rangeland is to make sure we don't lose grass and rangeland to cultivation. That's our number one problem. So again, this is something that not only are we trying, but we're doing it in very strategic fashion where we think we're going to have the biggest benefit for wildlife, where we have communities that already want to work with us, and we have those intact cores that we'll be sewing up. On a very similar note, we have again, another tool in our toolbox called conservation easements. And these are legal agreements that we negotiate with landowners on a voluntary basis, in which we essentially purchase future development rights to a ranch. In this case, we're trying to prevent future conversion to subdivision or to cultivated farm fields and the like. And so these are very costly. They're very complicated partnerships put together. But what we've done through the frameworks is found just incredible rock stars and partnerships that have been able to take these concepts and put them into action, provide us a proof of action, proof of concept. And the one that we have for conservation easements is our partnership in the state of Montana, where over the last decade they have been able to put together tens of millions of dollars with this incredible partnership that's conserved 250,000 acres perpetually of some of the most important intact landscapes that, again, not only provide for a future for these families, but also provide world-class wildlife habitat. They maintain big game and other bird migration corridors and the like. And again, these are the types of things that are included in these frameworks. All told, in the Great Plains Grasslands Biome framework, our state conservationists have targeted roughly 10 million acres of on-the-ground conservation over the next 5 years, primarily focused on those two threats, right? The big drivers of biome change, woodland expansion and land use conversion. These are goals that the state conservationists are using all of their resources with those of their partners to obtain, and ones that we will be working together to quantify and track progress and report back to partners. Here's where we're at. Here's where we'll be quantifying outcomes, so we can speak to, what benefits did we have to populations of wildlife? What benefits did we have to the underlying economics of ranchers? What benefits did we have to the climate adaptations in mitigation? So again, real excited to have these come to fruition. We will be announcing these shortly and releasing them shortly, so definitely keep an eye on that. But again, like Martin said, this is not something that's, quote, brand new for an agency. It's really a continuation of what we've been doing, but we're doing it in a much more deliberate and comprehensive fashion. So with that, I thank you again for your time today. We look forward to questions.